When it comes to global solution networks, it turns out that these are kind of like the elephant and the blindfolded person. Someone approaches them and they think, well, they're like a trunk, or they're like a snake, or they're like a wall. It turns out that there are 10 different types. It took us a year to figure this out. And they are so committed to memory, I will go through briefly and just introduce them right now. The first is knowledge networks. Now, we've always had global, for a long time, global knowledge networks, international scientific consortia and so on. But these things now can scale astronomically. We've never had things like TED or Wikipedia or the Khan Academy, 300 million people collaborating together and learning, or something like Galaxy Zoo, hundreds of thousands of amateur astronomers working together to map the heavens. Knowledge networks. Number two is advocacy networks. Now, advocacy has been around for a long time too, including on a global basis, international movements to do this or that. But we've never had something like Kony 2012, where I watched this movie about the Ugandan warlord, Joseph Kony. He's a bad guy. He's kidnapped 60,000 children, apparently. The girls become sex slaves, the boys become soldiers. If you misbehave, it's terrible. He cuts off your face, or you have to kill your family, or some horrific thing. So people didn't know about him, and this network called Invisible Children decided to make Joseph Kony famous. I watched this movie on a Monday night. 12,000 people had seen it. By the time I watched it at noon on Friday, over 80 million people had seen this half-hour movie. And very quickly, the US Congress took action. Now, they haven't found Joseph Kony, but his life's a lot tougher, and his ability to do stuff is a lot tougher. So advocacy can scale. Now, there are problems with every one of these, but we'll get to those later. Okay, a third type is what we call operational and delivery networks. They're not creating knowledge, they're not advocating, they're just fixing problems. So these global institutions, for some reason, can't get a $70 pump to a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa. So Kiva, a global solution network, decides we'll just do it. They go raise hundreds of millions of dollars in small donations, and they deliver pumps. They're just solving the problem. I mean, my daughter lives in the East Village in New York, and when Hurricane Sandy hit, you put out some tweets to one of these networks, Crisis Commons, and people would show up and they'd help you. They'd bring sandbags or something like that. Now, a fourth type of network is what we call policy networks. These are extraordinary. They're developing policy for governments or international organizations or for companies, but they're not controlled by states. They're global solution networks. For example, international competition policy is now created by a GSN. The fifth type that we have is what we call watchdog networks. These are networks that are in the transparency business. So Human Rights Watch is out all around the world, and they're just trying to find out the truth. And transparency, it turns out, is a wonderful force for change and for protecting freedoms and rights. Sunlight is a great disinfectant. So we have not just Human Rights Watch, but the Sunlight Foundation, Transparency International, and other watchdog networks. The sixth type, I call it platforms. Now, platforms aren't trying to solve a specific problem necessarily of climate change or cooking fires or poverty or conflict or gender violence or whatever. They're creating a platform for others to do that. So Ushahidi would be a platform created by a young Kenyan lawyer named Ori Okolo right after the 2007 elections in Kenya. There was terrible violence, and she implemented a platform whereby people could solve a problem, to identify the violence that was occurring and to report it to others, because the local media and the civil society wasn't strong enough to do that. And eventually this led to the end of the violence. Now, Ushahidi is now a global platform where people are solving all kinds of problems, from dealing with the aftermath of the disaster in the Philippines or the earthquake in Haiti, to Snowmageddon in Washington, D.C., where people used ushahidi after a massive snowfall for days to find out what was going on. Now, 7 type were really initiated over the last period because standards activities were all state-controlled. The ISO was created in the 1940s, International Standards Organization. It was really controlled pretty much by states. Now the ISO is a multi-stakeholder network, and most standards activities today are multi-stakeholder. You consider all the activities around to create standards for something like the Internet. The Internet Engineering Task Force is a global solution network, part of one. The World Wide Web Consortium, W3C Consortium, is a global solution network creating standards for the web. The 8th type is what we call diasporas. Now these are people, large numbers, millions or tens of millions of people who've left their ancestral lands, but they still identify with the motherland. And diasporas do all kinds of things, but one of the things they do is to help try and solve global problems. My father-in-law was the president of the Sporting Football Club of Canada, supporting the local team back in Lisbon, one of the big European football teams. And they raised money for the team, but they also raised money to do good things in Canada and in other parts of the world. So diasporas now are becoming a kind of global solution network. Number 9 is extraordinary. These are, we call them governance networks. There are now resources on planet Earth that are governed by a multi-stakeholder network that's not controlled by a state or states. The best example would be the ecosystem that governs the Internet. This is an ecosystem that does many of the other types of GSN. They create knowledge, they advocate, they just do things. That would be ICANN, just implements the domain name system. There are standards activities like the ones that I mentioned, and you put those, well, they're policy networks like the Internet Governance Forum, the Internet Society that's coordinating a lot of this activity. You put those all together and you have the global governance of an important resource, not controlled by states. So you've got to ask yourself, if we can govern the Internet that way, what else could we govern? Could we govern the climate? Could that be the key to climate change? Creating a global governance network for the climate? And the final type is what we call networked institutions. Like governance networks, they do many of these 10 functions. The World Economic Forum, the Clinton Global Initiative, the Business for Social Responsibility, the UN Global Compacts, not controlled by the United Nations. These all meet the characteristics of global solution networks. They're multi-stakeholder, the Internet, they're solving a global problem or problems, and they're not controlled by a state. And these are extraordinary institutions, some of them becoming enormously influential and powerful in helping us achieve global cooperation and even governance. So, you're a person, you're a company, you're part of an NGO, you're part of a government, you're trying to solve a global problem. We now have 10 vehicles. Rather than just giving money away, philanthropy, maybe you could create a network. Rather than trying to attack a problem through the knee-jerk reaction that we all have is to be an advocate for change, maybe you could do something else. Maybe you can just deliver the change through an operational and delivery network. Maybe you can bring transparency to the problem through a watchdog network. Maybe you can create the knowledge that's required to crack this problem open through a knowledge network. Maybe you can create a policy and work together with others in a network to create a policy that can make a difference in the world. So this is a very important breakthrough, this taxonomy, if you like, for describing how global problems can be solved. Now, one final thought. Any network in the world can be said to fall primarily into one category. But this is not like a taxonomy in the biological sciences where you have true mutual exclusivity. Like there are some networks that are fundamentally an advocacy network, but they also do some knowledge creation and maybe create a little policy. So we don't want to be too strict in our definition of these. Rather, we want to use this taxonomy as a powerful tool for helping us understand what makes these networks tick and how we can make them more effective in addressing the many problems facing us as a global society.